Picture a flock of geese in flight. You know the shape, one bird out front cutting through the wind, the rest fanning out behind it in a long V, each one riding the slipstream of the bird just ahead. Clean, orderly, each bird doing its part in its rightful place. Back in the 1930s, a Japanese economist looked at that formation and thought, "That's Asia." He called it the flying geese paradigm. The logic is almost beautiful in its simplicity. One country develops first, the lead goose. It builds up factories, industrializes, gets richer. Then its wages creep up and suddenly the low-margin, sweat-heavy work, textiles, toys, basic electronics assembly, stops making sense to do at home. So it passes the baton. Japan handed it to South Korea and Taiwan. They caught up, got expensive, and passed it on to Southeast Asia. And so it goes. Industry always flowing downhill toward cheaper hands. The model is elegant. And if you squint a little, it kind of worked for a while. But here's where it gets complicated. China was supposed to be next in that chain. China's wages have climbed. The cities have gleaming skylines. By every traditional measure, it should be handing off its t-shirts and plastic toys and basic assembly work to Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, whoever's willing to work for less now. Except it isn't. Not really. And that is the question this video is about. Not whether China will eventually change, it will. But why, right now, in 2026, against everything the textbook predicts, China is still hanging on to the work it was supposed to have given up a decade ago. In late May 2026, The Economist ran a piece with a deliberately provocative title, "The Other China Shock." The other one. As in, we've been through this before and we thought we knew what it looked like. The first China shock is something economists still argue about. A famous MIT study found that after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, the flood of cheap Chinese goods into global markets wiped out roughly 2 million U.S. manufacturing jobs. Just gone. Entire towns hollowed out. That shock was built on one thing: the most abundant, cheapest labor force the modern world had ever seen. This new shock is almost the exact opposite. China isn't competing on being cheap anymore. It's competing on being capable, using advanced technology to defend the very manufacturing segments that are supposed to be beneath it now. The low-end stuff. The anyone-could-do-this stuff. The stuff the flying geese model said should belong to Vietnam and Bangladesh. Let's see what the numbers actually say. A joint paper from Johns Hopkins and the Peterson Institute, published just this past May, puts it bluntly. China has gotten dramatically richer and more technologically sophisticated, and it's still planted firmly on the cheapest tier of global manufacturing, competing directly with economies a fraction of its income level. Here's what really stops you cold. Look at China's share of global exports from 2010 to 2024, broken down by tier: low-end goods, mid-range goods, high-end goods, resource-based goods, for separate tiers. In every single one, China's share went up. Not held steady at some impressive level. Not declined gracefully as the textbooks predicted. Up. Across every tier simultaneously. Now, to be fair, the story is more layered than that headline suggests. Take garments, the most labor-intensive thing you can make. Just stitching fabric into a shirt. If any industry should have left China, it's this one. And the numbers show it has, partially. China's share of global apparel exports peaked near 39% in the mid-2010s and has since slid to about 29.6%. Its lowest point in 15 years. Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India have genuinely picked up that slack. So the geese model isn't completely wrong. Some work did move. But here's what makes your stomach drop a little. Now look at the layer before the garment, the fabric, the yarn, the raw textile inputs. Over that same period, China's share of those inputs didn't fall. It rose from around 30% to 43%. Let that sink in. The sewing went to Vietnam. The fabric that Vietnam sews with? Still coming from China. There's a number in the research that really drives this home. Across 30 low- and middle-income countries' garment and textile exports, China supplies 64% of the underlying value. Which means that "Made in Vietnam" label you're reading is telling you where the last pair of hands touched it. It's not telling you where most of the value came from. The outer shell of global manufacturing is moving. The skeleton underneath isn't going anywhere. So why? How does a country that's gotten this wealthy keep winning at the cheapest game in the room? The Economist piece offers two answers, and both are worth sitting with. The first is almost comically simple. China is just enormous. A development economist put it this way: if every other country is a goose in the formation, China is a pterodactyl that somehow squeezed into the flock. It's not a single economy at a single stage of development. It's a dozen different economies at a dozen different stages, all operating inside the same borders at the same time. The numbers make this almost absurd. China's 4 wealthiest cities, home to around 84 million people, have a GDP per capita that beats Japan's. China's 4 poorest provinces, home to about 140 million people, are economically closer to Vietnam. If you could peel China apart by income level, you'd find something like 0.7 Japan's, 6 Malaysia's, 5 Mexico's, 4 Thailand's, and 1.4 Vietnam's, all stacked on top of each other. This is genuinely strange to think about. It means China doesn't have to be one thing or the other. When coastal factories get too expensive, they don't have to move to a different country. They move to Hunan, Sichuan, Chongqing, the inland provinces where land and labor are still cheaper. The outsourcing happens. It just never crosses a border. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You might think, okay, but if workers can freely move from poor provinces to rich ones, wages should eventually equalize. The cheap interior should eventually get expensive too, and then work will have to leave. That logic is sound. It should happen. And yet it hasn't, not at the pace you'd expect. China seems to be getting away with having it both ways. Rising wages at the top, persistent cost advantages at the bottom indefinitely. Economists find this genuinely puzzling. It's one of the things that makes China hard to fit into any clean model. The second reason: China isn't playing defense on labor costs. It's changing the game entirely. Asterisk asterisk. The most direct way to fight a wage increase is to need fewer wages. And nobody has been more aggressive about that than China. According to the International Federation of Robotics, Chinese factories installed 295,000 industrial robots in 2024. That's more than half of global demand for that year, and more than Japan, the US, South Korea, and Germany combined. The total robot fleet in Chinese factories has now crossed 2 million, the largest in the world. What's striking isn't just the scale. It's where these robots are going. Not just into cutting-edge auto plants and chip fabricators, the places you'd expect. They're flooding into textiles, leather, food processing, furniture, the most unglamorous old school. This will never be automated corners of manufacturing. Robot installations in food and beverage processing alone jumped 86% in a single year. When that happens at scale, something fundamental shifts. Labor cost stops being the deciding factor. You could offer a factory owner cheaper workers in Vietnam, and the honest answer might be, we don't need that many workers anymore. The wage gap that the flying geese model depends on? Automated away before it can do its job. Both of these reasons are real and both matter. But I want to push past them, because I don't think they fully explain what's happening. Here's why. Inland Chinese wages are still higher than Vietnamese wages. Vietnam is building industrial parks and offering tax incentives. And robots aren't a Chinese secret. Any factory in Hanoi can buy the same machines. So if the ingredients are available everywhere, why does the recipe only seem to fully work in China? I think the real answer isn't about any single factory at all. It's about what happens when you put tens of thousands of factories in the same place for long enough. Let me make this concrete because this is the part that I think most people in the US genuinely don't feel in their gut. Imagine you're building a hardware product, a gadget, a device, a piece of electronics, and you're doing it in Shenzhen. A few miles from where you're sitting is a place called Huiqiangbai. Imagine if Times Square were entirely devoted to electronic components. Floor after floor of stalls selling every conceivable circuit board, sensor, motor, display, and connector ever manufactured. Most of it available by the handful, walk-in, cash and carry. Now add a few city blocks of mold shops, fabrication studios, and prototyping labs around the edges of that. You tweak a design in the morning. You have a physical sample in your hands by evening. You find a flaw at midnight. You have a revised version by the next morning. Not a simulation. A real physical object you can hold, test, and break. That speed is money. Literally. Every product development cycle that takes a week in Shenzhen might take a month somewhere else. Multiply that across the life of a company, and it's not a marginal advantage, it's a different kind of company entirely. Now imagine trying to replicate your production somewhere else, Vietnam, say, to save 30% on labor. A mold breaks. The local shop can't fix it. Sends it back to Guangdong. Component runs short. Not stocked locally, order from China. Wait. A machine fails. No technician nearby. Fly one in. 3 days becomes 3 weeks. The wage savings evaporate into logistics nightmares, quality problems, and delays that cost you customers. And that's the actual fear inside every China exit conversation happening in boardrooms right now. Not that Chinese workers are expensive. It's that the moment you leave, you're not just changing factories. You're unplugging from a system, and suddenly everything runs slower, breaks more often, and costs more to fix. Apple's CEO has said something close to this publicly. Why Apple's manufacturing is in China isn't really about labor costs. It's about the density of talent, tooling engineers, mold designers, machining specialists. He described how you could put every tool and die engineer in the United States in a single room. To do the same with China's, you'd need several football stadiums. Think about what that means. Apple doesn't need cheap workers. It needs those stadiums. And right now, no other place on Earth has them. Now maybe you're skeptical. This is the part of the video where I want to honor that skepticism because it's a real objection. Can't Vietnam just train more engineers? Can't Indonesia build those industrial clusters? Technicians can be developed. Parts can be stockpiled. Prototypes can be 3D printed. We have AI tools now. Doesn't the tyranny of physical proximity get weaker every year? Honestly, yes, for each individual piece. One technician? Absolutely trainable. One component? Pre-order it. One mold problem? You can probably fix it remotely. Taken in isolation, every single link in that chain has a workaround. But here's what that argument misses. Manufacturing at scale isn't about whether you can solve any one problem. It's about what happens when 500 problems pile up at the same time, and whether your system handles that gracefully or collapses. There's a word for what a supply chain becomes when it reaches a certain scale and density. It's borrowed from complexity science, and it's been all over AI discussions lately. Emergence. The idea is that when a system's parts are numerous enough and connected densely enough, the system as a whole starts doing things none of the individual parts can do alone. A single ant is not smart. It follows a few simple rules. Follow pheromones, carry food, defend the nest. That's it. But a colony of ants, thousands of them, each following those same simple rules, builds intricate underground cities, routes food efficiently across long distances, and coordinates defenses that look almost tactical. No ant planned any of this. It emerged from the density of interaction. A factory making bolts is just a factory making bolts. But put 50,000 suppliers, mold shops, logistics firms, testing labs, material processors, and specialized technicians all within a few hours of each other. All buying from each other, all competing with each other, all watching each other, and the network starts doing something qualitatively different. It can sense demand shifts and respond before anyone issues a memo. It can pivot entire product categories in weeks. It can absorb a crisis and reconstitute on the other side. This isn't mystical. It's not a uniquely Chinese property. Silicon Valley's tech ecosystem does it. Hollywood does it with films. Open-source software communities do it. When you pack enough people with complementary skills into the same space, doing enough overlapping things, something clicks into place that you couldn't have designed from the top down. China just happened to build this particular version of that for manufacturing at a scale nobody's matched. The most vivid example I can give you is one most Americans felt: the 2020 mask shortage. Remember that? Masks were impossible to find for weeks. And a lot of people were shocked. A mask is simple. It's non-woven fabric, a metal strip, 2 ear loops. Half the internet said, anyone can make these. So why couldn't we? Because a mask isn't a product. A mask is a supply chain. You need melt-blown polymer for the filtration layer. You need the industrial machines to bond the layers together. You need technicians who know how to calibrate those machines. You need testing equipment. You need packaging lines. And you need all of those things simultaneously in the same place. China didn't have a giant mask stockpile. What China had was a manufacturing ecosystem. And within 2 to 3 months of the outbreak, auto plants, electronics manufacturers, and appliance factories, companies that had never made a mask in their lives, pivoted and started producing them in volume because the surrounding system could support that transformation. That's not any one company being clever. That's an entire living system reshaping itself. China's EV surge is the same story on a bigger stage. Chinese automakers launched more new EV models last year alone than Germany launched across the entire previous decade. You don't do that through planning. You do that when 1,000 suppliers, battery makers, software developers, and fabricators all happen to be within driving distance of each other, all hungry, all competing. This also quietly explains something that gets talked about a lot but rarely unpacked fully: the de-risking phenomenon. Dozens of major companies have spent the last few years loudly announcing they're moving manufacturing out of China, diversifying their supply chains, reducing their exposure. And many of them have moved something. Vietnam's exports to the US have genuinely surged. Factories have genuinely opened. But look at what actually moved. Mostly the final assembly step, the last pair of hands before the product ships. And look at what didn't move. The components, the materials, the tooling. In 2025, Vietnam imported around $186 billion worth of goods from China, which means the supply chain didn't leave. It just got a new last stop before the airport. So let's come back to the Geese. The flying geese model imagined a clean, orderly relay race. Lead goose rises, hands off the baton, drops back, and a new bird takes the front. Each economy gets its turn. The ladder of development climbs reliably upward, rung by rung, country by country. What's actually happening in Asian manufacturing today looks nothing like that. It looks like a murmuration of starlings. You've probably seen one, even if you didn't know the word. Tens of thousands of birds, swooping and turning in perfect unison, forming shapes in the sky that look like they were choreographed by a single intelligence. But there's no conductor. No bird is in charge. Each one is just watching its 3 nearest neighbors and adjusting. And out of that, out of nothing but local rules and density, comes something that moves like a single living thing. You can take one bird out of a murmuration. The shape shifts, absorbs it, closes back up. You can't take the murmuration out of the sky. That's what Chinese manufacturing has become. Not a collection of factories that could theoretically be moved somewhere else. A living system of interaction and density that produces capabilities no individual factory possesses. And that took decades of compounding scale to grow. For Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, the honest implication of all this might be uncomfortable. The most realistic path forward probably isn't trying to become the next China. It's finding the specific niche in this already existing network where you're genuinely irreplaceable, one material, one component, one step in the chain that you can own. Not because their ambitions should be small, but because fully severing from China's supply chain is, in practice, one of the hardest things an economy can do. What we call manufacturing leaving China might more accurately be described as the network growing new branches, while the root system stays exactly where it is. Which brings us to what I think is actually the most interesting paradox in all of this. A manufacturing system this entrenched, this hard to dislodge, this dominant should be printing money. It should be comfortable. Instead, the words you keep hearing out of China's industrial sector right now are overcapacity, price wars, collapsing margins, a kind of grinding, self-defeating competition where everyone works harder and harder, and the profits get thinner and thinner. If today's question was why does the river keep flowing through China, that's a productive, almost satisfying question, and I think we've answered it. But the next question is darker and I think more urgent. What happens when a river runs too fast, in a channel that's been dug too deep? Does it carve out something magnificent? Or does it eventually undercut its own banks and flood everything around it? That's next time.